I started driving before sunrise, the sky still the color of damp steel, because I wanted to arrive early. I had pressed my suit the night before, the same dark one I wore to my wife's funeral years ago, careful not to crease it wrong. I kept imagining the moment I would see my daughter in her wedding dress, the way she used to twirl in front of the mirror as a girl asking me if she looked pretty. 70 years on this earth, and that image was still enough to steady my hands on the wheel. The venue rose out of the trees like something from a magazine spread. Iron gates, white stone, cars that cost more than every truck I had ever owned combined. I slowed as I approached, already feeling out of place, but telling myself it didn't matter. I was her fifth. That had to count for something. The security guard stepped forward, one hand lifted. He asked my name, checked a tablet, and then checked it again. He didn't look at me when he spoke into his radio. When he finally met my eyes, there was apology there, but also certainty. I was not allowed to enter. No discussion, no exceptions. My phone buzzed before I could ask a single question. A message from my daughter. Short, careful. She asked me to leave quietly. She said it would be better for everyone. She said we would talk later. I sat there for a moment, the engine idling, watching strangers pass through the gate, meant for me. Then I put the car in reverse. I didn't argue. I didn't call her name. I simply turned around. And as I pulled away, I understood that something far bigger than a wedding had just ended. I had driven for hours believing that this day was the last thing I could give her as a father. Not money, not advice, just my presence. I had imagined standing at the end of the aisle, my arm offered, her hand resting lightly on mine. I never thought I would have to imagine the moment from outside a locked gate. The road away from the venue felt longer than the drive there. My jaw was tight, but my hands stayed steady. I kept waiting for anger to hit me, for something hot and uncontrollable to rise in my chest. It didn't. What came instead was a strange hollow calm that scared me more than rage ever could. I had always been a simple man. I worked with my hands. I fixed what broke. I showed up when I said I would. When my wife died, I learned how to survive on routine and responsibility. Raising our daughter alone became my entire world. I didn't resent it. I didn't feel cheated. I believed that was what being a father meant. Walking her down the aisle wasn't about tradition to me. It was closure. Proof that everything I had poured into her life had led to this moment. Proof that I had done something right. At the gate, none of that mattered. The guard hadn't been cruel. That almost made it worse. He kept calling me sir, kept saying he was just following instructions. When I asked if there had been a mistake, he shook his head once and said quietly, "I'm sorry. I was told not to explain." That was when I knew this wasn't confusion. This was a decision. The text from my daughter didn't insult me. It didn't accuse me. It simply erased me. She framed my absence as a necessity, like removing an eyesore before guests arrived. I read the message 3 times each time, hoping I had misunderstood the tone. I hadn't. I didn't respond. I didn't ask why. I had learned over a lifetime that some answers only humiliate you further when they're given reluctantly. I drove until the venue disappeared from my mirrors. Somewhere behind those gates, music would start. Chairs would scrape. People would turn and smile on cue. My daughter would walk forward radiant, surrounded by a perfection that required my absence to exist. I realized then that this wasn't about a wedding. It was about image, about control, about who fit into the picture she wanted to present to the world and who did not. And in that picture, I was a liability. As the miles passed, memories surfaced without my permission. Her first bike. The night she called me from college, crying because she didn't know how she would pay for next semester. The countless times I told her not to worry, that I would handle it. I had always handled it, quietly, without conditions, without asking to be seen. I remembered how proud I felt when she got engaged, how careful she was with her words even then. How often she talked about venues, guest lists, aesthetics. How rarely she talked about marriage itself. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself all brides got carried away. At the gate, those excuses fell apart. I pulled onto the highway and let the car settle into its rhythm. There was a hotel exit I missed without noticing. Then another. I didn't care where I ended up. For the first time in years, there was nothing waiting for me that required immediate fixing. The silence inside the car grew heavy. I turned off the radio. I wanted to hear my own thoughts clearly, no matter where they led. That was when something shifted. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. I understood that everything I had given her had been given freely. But I also understood finally that giving freely did not mean giving endlessly. Somewhere along the way, my silence had taught her that I would always step aside. That my role was to support, not to matter. At the gate, she had tested that belief, and I had confirmed it by leaving without a word. I thought about turning back. The idea surfaced quietly, almost gently. I could call her. I could apologize for something I hadn't done. I could ask what she needed. I could fix it the way I always had. But I didn't. Because for the first time I saw the cost of fixing everything. I saw how much of myself I had already given away without realizing it. And I knew that if I turned back now, nothing would ever change. The sun was higher when I finally pulled over at a rest stop. I sat there with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, and let myself feel the weight of what had happened. I wasn't banned from a wedding. I was removed from a version of fatherhood that depended on me staying small. I started the car again and merged back onto the highway. Somewhere behind me, guests were taking their seats. Somewhere behind me, my daughter was preparing to walk forward without looking for me. By the time the ceremony began, I had already made a decision that would change everything. I didn't realize how far I'd driven until the road signs stopped making sense. The names blurred together, towns I had never planned to pass through, exits I had no memory of choosing. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my body felt disconnected, like I was watching myself from somewhere just above my shoulder. I kept waiting for the pain to break through, for my chest to tighten, for my eyes to burn. None of that happened. What settled in instead was a quiet pressure, heavy and patient, as if something had finally caught up with me after years of running just ahead of it. I had always thought of myself as a good father. Not perfect, just present. I was the one who woke up early to make breakfast even when my back ached from the day before. I was the one who sat through school plays where she barely had a line, clapping like she was the star. When my wife died, the world narrowed down to 2 people, and I made a promise to myself that my daughter would never feel like she came second to grief. I worked jobs that didn't leave room for excuses. Construction maintenance, anything that paid honestly and asked for my hands more than my words. I came home tired, but I came home. That mattered to me. I never wanted her to wonder if I'd show up. As the miles passed, memories surfaced the way they do, when you're finally too tired to push them away. Her first day of school gripping my hand like she might float off without it. The night she came home crying because a boy had laughed at her shoes, and I told her it didn't matter, that people who mattered wouldn't notice. I believed that. I still do. I never saw those moments as sacrifices. That word always felt too dramatic. This was my life. This was my child. You don't keep score when you love someone. You just keep going. Somewhere along the way, though, love without limits turned into something else. I didn't see it at the time. I thought consistency was enough, that if I stayed steady, everything else would take care of itself. I remembered the first time she needed help with money after leaving home. She tried to sound casual on the phone, joked about budgeting, then went quiet. I didn't let her finish explaining. I told her not to worry. I handled it the way I always had. No lecture, no reminder. Just a check sent quietly, my name printed in small letters at the corner. That became a pattern. tuition gaps, security deposits, emergencies that weren't really emergencies, just shortfalls between ambition and reality. I never asked how she would manage next time. I never asked what her plan was. I assumed she was learning, growing, becoming independent in ways I didn't need to oversee. Looking back, I see how that assumption protected me from uncomfortable conversations. It was easier to believe she didn't need guidance anymore than to risk becoming the kind of father who asked questions she didn't want to answer. I pulled off the highway eventually, not because I needed gas, but because my body needed a pause. I parked near a line of trucks and shut off the engine. The silence was immediate and complete. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the dashboard, noticing how still everything felt. That was when another thought settled in, unwelcome but undeniable. I had made it easy for her to forget what my support actually meant. Not because I hid it, but because I never asked her to acknowledge it. Gratitude fades when it's never required. I thought about the way she had spoken to me over the past year, polite, efficient, like someone managing a resource rather than talking to a parent. I had noticed it, of course, but every time the discomfort surfaced, I pushed it down. I told myself she was busy, planning a wedding, building a future. I told myself a lot of things. There were documents I had signed over the years, arrangements made with the kind of foresight that comes from knowing life can turn on you without warning. I never thought of those things as power. They were safety nets. Quiet ones. The kind you hope never get tested. My name appeared on papers she never read. On agreements meant to stabilize, not control. I had done it that way, on purpose. I didn't want leverage. I wanted security. For her. For the life she was building. At the gate, that intention stopped mattering. I realized, sitting there with the engine cooling in front of me, that love doesn't prevent imbalance. Silence creates it. By never asserting myself, I had taught everyone around her that I would always be there, no matter how little space I was given. I thought about the months leading up to the wedding, how conversations shifted, how she spoke about the venue like it was the point of the day, not the marriage, how she laughed nervously when I asked simple questions like where I should sit or what time she wanted me there. I remembered one phone call in particular. I had suggested we have dinner, just the two of us, before things got busy. She hesitated, then said maybe after the honeymoon. Not unkindly, just distant. I told her that was fine. I always said it was fine. That night, sitting in my car, I finally asked myself a question I had avoided for years. When did being understanding turn into being invisible? The answer hurt more than I expected. It wasn't something she did all at once. It was something I allowed slowly, because I believed love meant stepping aside. I got back on the road and drove until I found a small motel, the kind with thin curtains and a flickering vacancy sign. I checked in without making eye contact, took the key, and carried my bag into a room that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet. I sat on the edge of the bed, jacket still on, and let the quiet settle around me. The room felt neutral, safe. No expectations. No one waiting for me to solve anything. For the first time that day, my phone stayed silent. I thought about calling someone, a friend, a relative, anyone who might listen. But I didn't. I wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. This wasn't something that needed witnesses. It needed honesty. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, counting the small cracks in the paint. I felt tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. Tired of smoothing things over. Tired of pretending that being easygoing meant being respected. I didn't regret what I had given her. I still don't. Love given freely is never wasted. But I did regret confusing love with self-erasure. Regret mistaking silence for peace. Outside cars passed on the road, their headlights briefly washing over the curtains. Somewhere my daughter was still in her wedding dress. Somewhere music was playing, and people were smiling for pictures that would last longer than the moment deserved. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes. Not to sleep, but to think clearly. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't planning how to help. I was deciding how to stop disappearing. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't with anger in my chest. It was with a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted. I had spent my life showing up without being asked. Now I needed to learn how to stay back without apologizing. By morning, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing that happened at that gate was accidental, and nothing from this point on would be automatic. I stopped at a roadside diner just off the highway, the kind with vinyl booths and a bell over the door that rang too loudly when you walked in. Inside, people were laughing over coffee, talking about nothing that mattered, and for a moment I felt like I'd stepped into a different life, one where weddings didn't end at locked gates. I slid into a booth by the window and ordered eggs I barely touched. The waitress called me hon and refilled my coffee without asking. Ordinary kindness. It hit harder than it should have. As I stared out at the parking lot, memories lined up in my head, neat and relentless, like they'd been waiting for permission. The last year came back first. The way every conversation with my daughter had slowly turned into a discussion about how things looked. Colors, lighting, seating arrangements. Who should be seen with whom? She spoke about the wedding like it was a performance that needed perfect timing and flawless angles. Whenever I tried to ask something simple where I should be, what she needed from me, she'd smile tightly and say, "Don't worry, Dad. It's all handled." I told myself that was independence. I told myself I was proud of her for taking charge. I didn't consider that being handled might include handling me out of the picture. I remembered the first time she used the word image in a serious way. We were on the phone and she was explaining why a smaller venue wouldn't work. "It has to feel right," she said. "People expect a certain level." I asked who the people were. She laughed and said I was overthinking it. Maybe I was. Or maybe I just didn't belong in the version of her life she was building. The man she was marrying came into focus next. I had met him enough times to recognize the pattern. He was charming in a careful way, always polished, always aware of who was watching. He shook my hand firmly, smiled just long enough, then shifted his attention to someone who could offer something more useful. He never said anything rude to me. He didn't have to. His interest in me existed only when it served a purpose. Conversations stayed on the surface. Work, weather, generalities. He never asked about my life, never followed up on details. It felt like talking to someone who had already decided what category I fit into. I noticed how he spoke about the future. Big plans, vague numbers, promises that sounded impressive but never specific. I didn't press. I had learned over the years that people who talk that way don't appreciate questions, and I didn't want to seem suspicious. I wanted to trust the choice my daughter had made. Trust is easier when you don't look too closely. The groom's family was harder to ignore. From the first meeting, there was a clear hierarchy in how they moved through the room. Expensive clothes worn casually, conversations that stopped just long enough for introductions, then resumed without me. They were never openly unkind. They simply didn't make space. At dinners, I found myself seated at the end of the table more than once. Not because there wasn't room, but because it was convenient. I told myself it didn't matter. I was there to support my daughter, not to be entertained. Looking back, I can see how often I excused behavior that made me feel smaller. How quickly I explained away discomfort as my own insecurity. I had never lived in their world. Of course it felt unfamiliar. Of course I felt out of place. But the truth was simpler than that. I wasn't meant to fit. I was meant to fade into the background, present enough to check a box, absent enough not to interfere. There was a moment a few weeks before the wedding that returned to me as I sat in that diner. We were on the phone and I mentioned that I'd arrive early on the day just in case she needed anything. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "Actually, it might be better if you came closer to the ceremony." I asked why. She said it would be hectic, that things were sensitive, that she didn't want stress. I heard myself say, "Of course." I heard myself back down without another question. At the time, it felt like understanding. Now, it felt like permission. The eggs in front of me had gone cold. I pushed the plate away and paid at the counter, leaving more than necessary because I didn't feel like calculating the right amount. Outside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of asphalt and pine. I stood there for a moment, keys in my hand, letting the truth settle in. This hadn't started at the gate. The gate was just the cleanest expression of it. Everything before that had been preparation. Small exclusions, gentle redirections, polite silences that taught me where I stood. As I got back into the car, I thought about how they probably described me when I wasn't around. Harmless, old-fashioned, simple, someone who wouldn't make a fuss, someone who would understand. Understanding can be a weapon when it's expected, but never returned. I drove again, not in a hurry, letting the road unfold without checking the clock. Somewhere behind me, the wedding was continuing, or trying to. I imagined my daughter moving through the day with that tight smile I'd seen so often lately. The one that said everything was fine as long as no one asked the wrong questions. I wondered if she felt relief knowing I wasn't there, or if there was a flicker of guilt she quickly pushed aside. I wondered if she told herself she'd explain later, once things calmed down. People always promise themselves later. By the time I reached the motel, the sun was low. I parked near the far end away from the office and sat for a while before getting out. The quiet inside the car felt different now. Less hollow, more resolved. I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. My silence hadn't protected our relationship. It had reshaped it. It had taught her that my role was flexible, disposable when inconvenient. That realization hurt. But it also clarified things in a way pain often does. You can't fix what you refuse to name. Inside the room, I sat on the bed and took off my shoes, lining them up neatly out of habit. The room was plain, impersonal, and that suited me. No photos, no reminders, just space. I thought again about turning back, about calling her, about offering help she hadn't earned and didn't respect. The thought passed as quickly as it came, because now I knew what turning back would mean. It would mean agreeing that my absence was acceptable, that my place in her life depended on how well I fit into someone else's picture. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the muted sounds of the motel settling for the night. Somewhere down the road, music would still be playing. Speeches would be made, glasses raised. I closed my eyes not to escape, but to accept what was in front of me. She hadn't just chosen a wedding image over me. She had chosen a world where I didn't belong. And once you see that clearly, you can't pretend it away. When sleep finally came, it wasn't heavy. It was light and brief, filled with fragments of conversations and half-remembered laughter. I woke knowing that whatever happened next would not be accidental. Clarity has a way of doing that. Once it arrives, it doesn't leave room for illusions. The calm bothered me more than anger ever could. I drove with the windows down, late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the road, and kept waiting for something inside me to snap. It didn't. There was no surge, no heat, no urge to shout into the empty car. Just a steady awareness, like a line had been drawn, and I was finally standing on the right side of it. I had spent most of my life believing that restraint was strength. You didn't react. You absorbed. You handled things quietly, so other people could keep moving forward without stumbling over your feelings. That approach had served me well, in work and grief and raising a child alone. But now, with miles opening up in front of me, I saw how restraint could also be avoidance. How calm could be a way of refusing to look directly at what needed to change. I knew exactly what I could do. That knowledge had always been there, tucked away, unused. I had never thought of it as power. Power suggested intense strategy control. What I had built over the years were safeguards, backstops. Quiet structures meant to keep my daughter steady when life tilted unexpectedly. I thought about the categories rather than the details. Housing stability, guarantees that smoothed over rough transitions, agreements that made doors open without questions. None of it had ever come with lectures or conditions. I had never framed my help as leverage because I didn't want it to be leverage. I wanted it to be invisible, dependable, unquestioned. At the gate, invisibility became erasure. I pulled off at a rest stop overlooking a stretch of hills and parked beneath a sky just beginning to cool from blue to gray. I sat there with the engine running, phone in my hand, staring at a name I rarely used. The contact had been there for years, untouched most of the time, like a spare key kept for emergencies you hope never arrive. I told myself I could still turn back, that I could wait, that nothing had to be decided today. But the truth was already settled in my chest. Waiting would only be another way of agreeing to disappear. I made the call. The voice on the other end recognized mine immediately. There was no small talk, no questions about how I was feeling. We had always worked that way, efficient, precise. I gave instructions the same way I gave directions on a job site. Clear, limited, final. I didn't explain why. I didn't justify myself. I simply said that certain supports needed to be withdrawn, effective immediately. I asked what would happen next. I listened. I acknowledged timelines. I confirmed steps. When the voice on the other end paused, as if waiting for me to reconsider, I didn't fill the silence. I ended the call and set the phone down on the passenger seat, face down, like a tool I wouldn't need again tonight. I knew what I would not do. That mattered as much as what I had just done. I would not humiliate my daughter publicly. I would not expose her in front of people who already measured worth in appearances. I would not lash out or make a scene to balance the one she had quietly created for me. This wasn't about punishment. It was about absence. I had learned over a lifetime that absence speaks more clearly than anger when it's chosen deliberately. You don't need to explain it. You don't need to defend it. You simply remove what was never appreciated and let the space reveal its shape. The phone stayed silent as I sat there watching clouds slide slowly over the hills. Somewhere behind me, the wedding was beginning to fracture at the edges, not because of anything dramatic I had done, but because structures had been mistaken for decoration. Once removed, there was nothing to hold the weight. For a moment, doubt surfaced. It came quietly, carrying familiar images. My daughter at 6, asleep in the back seat, after a long day, her head tilted toward the window. My daughter at 12, furious with me for grounding her, then slipping a note under my door that night, apologizing in crooked handwriting. My daughter at 20, hugging me too tightly before moving away, promising she'd call more often than she did. The doubt asked a simple question. Was this too much? I let myself feel the question fully. I didn't rush past it. I didn't bury it under logic. I sat with it, breathing slowly, until the answer formed without effort. No. What was too much was pretending that exclusion didn't have a cost. What was too much was teaching her again and again that I would always absorb the impact of her choices so she wouldn't have to. I thought about the wedding itself, about how carefully everything had been curated. The venue, the guest list, the order of events. There had been no room for unpredictability, no room for people who didn't fit the narrative. I had been managed the same way. Positioned, delayed, ultimately removed. Turning back now would only reinforce that system. It would tell her that boundaries were flexible as long as they were crossed politely. I started the car and merged back onto the highway, the decision settling deeper with every mile. There was no rush. Nothing left to negotiate. The hardest part had already passed, and it hadn't looked the way I expected. It had looked like clarity. As dusk fell, I checked into a small hotel on the edge of town. The clerk slid the key across the counter without interest, and I appreciated that. I carried my bag to the room, set it down, and sat on the bed without turning on the lights. The room felt neutral, untouched by expectations. It was exactly what I needed. My phone buzzed once. Then again. Numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. Not because I was hiding, but because there was nothing left to explain. I thought about how easily people confuse calm with weakness. How often restraint is interpreted as permission. I had allowed that misunderstanding to grow for years because it felt easier than correcting it. Now correcting it felt unavoidable. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of traffic. The day replayed itself in fragments. The gate, the message, the drive, the call. Each moment felt distinct, deliberate, connected by a line I hadn't seen until now. I wasn't angry with my daughter. That surprised me. I was disappointed, yes, hurt. But beneath that was something steadier. An understanding that love without boundaries eventually turns into something unrecognizable. Something that asks one person to disappear so another can feel comfortable. That was not love I could participate in anymore. Outside, the sky darkened completely. Somewhere a reception was continuing under lights and music, people laughing loudly enough to drown out discomfort. Somewhere my absence was being explained away in careful phrases. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to let the weight of finality settle. I knew that what I had set in motion would not be easily reversed. That bridges might burn quietly without flames or sound. For the first time in my life, that didn't feel terrifying. It felt honest. When sleep came, it was deep and untroubled. And when I woke later in the night, the room still and dark, I knew something else with certainty. While the wedding had just begun, something far more important had already ended. And in that ending, I had finally chosen myself without apology. The room was quiet in a way that made every sound feel deliberate. I closed the door behind me and set my bag down, leaving my jacket on as if I might need it again at any moment. The motel room smelled faintly of detergent and something older beneath it, a reminder that nothing here was meant to last. That suited me. I sat on the edge of the bed and reached into my bag, pulling out the folder I had carried without thinking about it for years. It was thin, unremarkable, the kind of thing you forget is there until you suddenly remember why you kept it close. I placed it on my lap and didn't open it right away. I didn't need to. I already knew what was inside. Everything I had ever done for my daughter had been guided by one simple idea. She should never feel cornered by circumstances. Life could be harsh enough without adding unnecessary fear. So when opportunities arose to create stability quietly, I took them. Not as a display of control, but as a precaution. The same way you reinforce a roof before winter, even if it looks fine from the outside. I finally opened the folder and looked through the papers, not to confirm anything, but to ground myself. My name appeared where it always had, unobtrusive, legal, easy to overlook if you weren't trained to notice it. I had agreed to that placement years ago, back when my daughter was still young enough to believe that adults could prevent all disasters if they planned carefully enough. Those arrangements were never meant to be used like this. They weren't weapons. They were insurance. Something that existed in the background so she could move forward without fear of falling too far if she slipped. I had told myself that was love, and it was. But love without limits has a way of becoming invisible to the people it protects. I thought about the advice I had received long ago from someone who understood these things better than I did. He had said, almost casually, "Keep a seat at the table, even if you never sit in it." At the time, I'd laughed it off. I didn't want a seat. I wanted my daughter to stand on her own. What I hadn't considered was how quickly people assume an empty seat means no one owns it. The realization settled in slowly as I sat there, folder open on my lap. By staying silent, by refusing to acknowledge my role, I had made it easy for others to underestimate me. Not just my daughter, but everyone around her. The groom, his family, advisors who saw stability as something that simply existed, not something someone had built. Invisible power is dangerous because it invites dismissal. People don't guard against what they can't see. I made another call, quieter than the first, my voice low and controlled. This time there were clarifications, confirmations, questions answered without drama. I listened carefully, absorbing the consequences without flinching. There would be ripple effects. There always are. But everything would remain lawful, contained, clean. I insisted on that. No spectacle, no humiliation. If things fell apart, they would do so under their own weight. When the call ended, I placed the phone beside the folder and closed it gently, as if sealing something fragile. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even particularly sad in that moment. What I felt was acceptance of the choice I had made and of what it would cost me, because I knew the cost would not be small. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, letting myself consider what I was giving up. Any illusion of being needed, any chance that my daughter would see this as anything other than betrayal. The possibility that she might never forgive me, not because I was wrong, but because forgiveness would require her to admit she had misjudged me. That was a heavy thing to accept. Parents are trained to believe that reconciliation is always the goal, that love means keeping the door open no matter how much it hurts to stand there. But love that requires you to erase yourself is not reconciliation. It is surrender. I had surrendered enough. Outside, the sounds of the evening drifted through the thin walls. A car door slammed. Someone laughed. Somewhere glasses were clinking. Speeches were being made, and the image my daughter had fought so hard to protect was already beginning to strain under pressure. I wondered if she felt it yet. The shift. The subtle wrongness in the air. Or if she was still clinging to the idea that everything could be fixed with the right explanation, the right call. I knew that call would come eventually. Not yet. Not while pride still held its ground. But soon. I sat up and placed the folder back into my bag, tucking it away with care. Then I turned off the lamp and lay back, the darkness settling over me like a blanket. Sleep didn't come right away. My mind wandered through years I had rarely revisited. The day she graduated. The way she hugged me quickly, already turning toward her friends. The first apartment she loved more than she loved the idea of me visiting. The subtle distance that grew with every milestone, each one taking her further into a world where my presence felt less necessary. I had told myself that was success. That this was how it was supposed to be. Parents raise children to leave. But there's a difference between leaving and erasing, between independence and dismissal. The gate had made that difference unmistakable. As the hours passed, I felt something else begin to surface. Not regret, not fear. Relief. Quiet, unexpected relief. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for the next request. I wasn't bracing myself to fix something before it broke. I wasn't managing someone else's comfort at the expense of my own. That realization felt almost guilty, like enjoying silence after years of noise. But I didn't push it away. I let myself feel it fully. By morning, the illusion surrounding the wedding would begin to crack. Not because I had exposed anything, but because protection had been mistaken for permanence. Without it, everyone involved would have to confront realities they had avoided. I rolled onto my side and closed my eyes, finally allowing sleep to take me. It was deeper this time, unbroken by dreams or half-formed worries. When I woke briefly in the night, the room was still, the world outside moving on without me. And in that stillness, I understood something that surprised me with its clarity. What I was withdrawing was not money. It was insulation. I had removed the layer that softened consequences and blurred accountability. Without it, people would reveal who they truly were. That knowledge didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel honest. I drifted back to sleep with that thought settled firmly in my chest. Whatever happened next would not be my doing. It would be the natural result of choices made long before I turned away from that gate. And for the first time, that was enough. I sat on the edge of the motel bed as the sky outside darkened, the light thinning until the room took on that muted blue that comes just before night settles in. Somewhere music would be starting. Somewhere people would be taking their seats, smoothing their clothes, checking mirrors. I didn't need to see it to know the timing. I had learned long ago how events move forward whether you're present or not. I left my phone on the nightstand, face up. I wasn't waiting for it to ring, but I wasn't avoiding it either. I wanted to see what happened when I did nothing at all. The first vibration came softly, almost polite. An unfamiliar number. I let it stop on its own. A minute later, another. Then a third. The pattern told me more than the calls themselves. Someone was trying to reach me without knowing exactly why. I imagined the ceremony beginning in small, awkward ways. Guests shifting in their seats. Someone whispering that things were running behind. A coordinator smiling too brightly while glancing at a watch. Delays always look harmless at first. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a call, but a message. Short, professional. It asked if I was nearby and available. No explanation, no context, just a question that assumed access. I set the phone back down without answering. I had spent years making myself available without being asked. Tonight, availability would have to be earned. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back an inch. The parking lot was half full, headlights cutting through the dusk as people came and went. Ordinary movement, ordinary lives. The world hadn't noticed the shift that had just begun, and that felt right. Another vibration. This time, the message carried a different tone. Apologetic. Vague. It mentioned unexpected issues and timing concerns. I smiled once without humor. Issues are only unexpected when you've never questioned what's holding everything together. I thought about the gate again. About how smoothly that decision had been executed. No debate. No hesitation. Orders followed because the structure allowed it. Tonight, that same structure was learning what happens when its foundation quietly disappears. I sat back down on the bed and listened as the motel settled into its nighttime rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. A television murmured through thin walls. Life continued in small, indifferent ways. Another call came through, then another. The intervals shortened. Urgency has a sound to it, even when you don't pick up. I imagined the groom now. The way he carried himself when everything went according to plan. The confidence that came from believing systems would always bend in his favor. Pressure has a way of revealing what polish hides. A voicemail arrived, clearly recorded by accident. Raised voices in the background, and a sharp, irritated tone that didn't sound anything like the man who had shaken my hand so carefully months earlier. Someone said my name. Someone else said it didn't matter. It mattered. I didn't delete the message. I didn't replay it. I didn't need to. The first crack had appeared, and cracks spread quietly before they become visible. I stepped outside the room and walked along the edge of the parking lot, the air cooler now carrying the smell of pine and asphalt. I needed movement, not distraction. With every step, the distance between me and the ceremony felt more intentional. Being excluded is one thing. Choosing absence is another. When I returned to the room, the phone was lit again. This time, the message was less careful. It asked what was happening. It asked if there had been a mistake. The words were still polite, but the certainty behind them was gone. I thought about how quickly authority dissolves when it no longer has anything to lean on. Another message came in, this one longer, explaining that guests were waiting, that certain arrangements were in flux, that people were becoming restless. The word embarrassing appeared once, then disappeared in a follow-up correction. I set the phone face down. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt inevitability. This was not a collapse caused by a single action. It was the result of a system built on assumptions no one bothered to examine. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the air unit. Somewhere a string quartet was probably filling silence with practiced grace. Somewhere chairs were being rearranged to hide the growing discomfort. Somewhere my daughter was standing in a dress she had chosen carefully, wondering why things felt wrong without knowing how to name it. That thought tightened something in my chest, but I didn't move. A message finally came from a number I recognized, but hadn't seen in years. It was brief and oddly formal. It asked if I could please call when convenient. Convenient. The word struck me harder than it should have. I remembered all the times I had rearranged my life to be convenient for her. The jobs I turned down. The plans I postponed. The weekends I stayed home just in case she needed something. Convenience had always flowed one way. I didn't call. Minutes passed. Then more. The phone stayed quiet long enough that I thought perhaps the ceremony had managed to limp forward. Then the silence broke again, sharper this time. Multiple messages in quick succession, frustration bleeding through professionalism, people accustomed to control scrambling to locate it again. I imagined the room at the venue now, smiles growing strained, guests checking phones, whispered questions spreading faster than answers. The image my daughter had worked so hard to protect blurring at the edges. Reputation depends on invisible support staying invisible. Once it's noticed, it's already too late. I noticed something else then. My daughter still hadn't called me. Not directly. Not once. Others were reaching out on her behalf, circling the problem, hoping to resolve it without forcing her to face what she'd done. That realization cut deeper than anything else that night. She was avoiding the one conversation that mattered. Not because she didn't care, but because caring would require accountability. And accountability has a way of dismantling carefully built narratives. I sat up and picked up the phone, turning it over in my hands without unlocking it. I considered for a brief moment breaking the silence, saying something that might stabilize the situation without fully undoing my boundary. The thought passed. Stabilizing it now would only teach the wrong lesson. That panic earns rescue. That exclusion can be explained away if the consequences are uncomfortable enough. Another message arrived. This one wasn't polite. It demanded an explanation. No greeting, no courtesy, just a question framed as an accusation. I didn't respond. I felt the night stretch on, heavy and deliberate. The motel room seemed smaller, not because it was closing in, but because the world outside it was finally being forced to confront something it had ignored. Eventually, the messages slowed. The calls stopped. The silence that followed was different from before. Deeper. Resigned. I knew what that meant. The ceremony might still be happening, but it was no longer what it was supposed to be. The celebration had turned inward, tense and uncertain. The perfect day was now something to be managed rather than enjoyed. I lay back down and closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to listen to my own breathing. Steady, even, unrushed. For the first time since the gate, I felt fully present in my body. Absence can be loud when it's intentional. As the night wore on, I understood that this was only the beginning. The consequences I had set in motion would continue unfolding long after the music stopped and the guests went home. They would surface in conversations, in looks exchanged behind closed doors, in questions that refused to stay buried. I didn't need to be there to see it. That was the point. When I finally turned off the light and let the darkness settle, there was no triumph in me, only a quiet certainty. I had done nothing publicly. I had said nothing dramatic. And yet, everything was changing. The silence didn't last. It fractured in uneven bursts, my phone lighting up again and again on the nightstand like something trying to crawl back to life. The tone had changed completely. Whatever confidence had carried those earlier messages was gone, replaced by confusion and a sharp edge of panic. I didn't reach for the phone right away. I listened instead, The quiet hum of the motel's air unit. A car passing somewhere on the road, my own breathing steady and unremarkable. I wanted to notice how little effort it took to stay still, while everything else began to unravel. The first message that came through didn't try to sound polite. It asked what was happening. The second asked why certain approvals were suddenly being questioned. The third didn't bother hiding its urgency at all. It simply said they needed to speak to me immediately. Needing someone is different from respecting them. I had learned that distinction too late. As the minutes passed, fragments of information reached me without anyone intending to provide them. A voicemail left in haste recorded while the caller thought they had already hung up. Voices layered over each other. Accusations. The word assumed used more than once, followed by an abrupt silence. Systems fail quietly at first. One hesitation triggers another. A signature delayed. A confirmation put on hold. Nothing dramatic enough to point to just enough uncertainty to stall momentum. When things are built on confidence rather than clarity, doubt spreads faster than any single action. I imagined the groom in the center of it trying to maintain control. I had seen how he handled himself when things went smoothly. Tonight would be different. Pressure doesn't create character, it reveals it. Another voicemail came through clearer this time. Raised voices no longer bothering to lower themselves for public ears. A man I barely recognized, in tone sharp and brittle, snapping at someone who couldn't give him what he wanted. The calm charm had evaporated. I sat back on the bed and let the phone fall silent again. Somewhere in the room where the celebration was supposed to be happening, people were starting to look at each other differently. Confusion breeds suspicion. Suspicion demands answers. And answers, when they finally arrive, rarely match the image everyone agreed to believe. The groom's family entered the picture next, at least from what I could gather. Their voices carried a different quality. Controlled, precise, less emotional, more strategic. Questions were being asked that had nothing to do with the ceremony and everything to do with what came after. I knew that tone well. I had heard it in boardrooms and legal offices over the years. It's the sound people make when they realize a situation isn't what they thought it was, and they need to reassess quickly. I imagined the shift in that room, the quiet recalibration, the subtle pulling away. When status-driven relationships sense instability, they don't confront it. They retreat. Guests would have noticed by then. Not the details, but the atmosphere. Laughter thinning out. Conversations breaking off mid-sentence. People checking their phones more often than necessary. The kind of discomfort no amount of decoration can hide. A wedding depends on collective belief. Everyone has to agree, if only for a few hours, that this is a beginning worth celebrating. When that belief wavers, everything feels performative. Another message came through, this one from someone closer to my daughter. It was phrased carefully, trying to balance concern with loyalty. It asked if there had been some misunderstanding that could be cleared up quickly. The word quickly did a lot of work in that sentence. I didn't respond. I noticed then what hadn't happened yet. My daughter still hadn't called me. Not once. Not even a missed call. That absence hurt more than the gate itself. It told me she was still trying to solve this without facing me. Still hoping the problem could be handled indirectly, quietly, without acknowledging the choice she'd made. Avoidance can look like composure from a distance. Up close, it's fear. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back a little more than before. The parking lot was quieter now, fewer cars coming and going. The night had settled into its deeper phase, the one where things either stabilize or fall apart completely. I thought about the image she had worked so hard to protect. How fragile it must feel now, stretched thin by questions no one had prepared for. How quickly perfection turns into pressure when there's no margin for error. The phone vibrated again. This time the message was blunt, almost accusatory. It demanded to know why certain commitments were suddenly in question. The entitlement in the phrasing was unmistakable. I felt a flicker of something then. Not anger. recognition. They weren't confused because something had been taken from them. They were confused because they had assumed it was never mine to withdraw. That assumption was the foundation of everything. I sat back down and let the phone go dark again. My role in this part of the night was finished. Anything I said now would only slow the lesson down. Minutes turned into an hour. The steady stream of messages slowed, then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before, like a room after an argument when everyone has retreated to opposite corners to reassess. I pictured my daughter finally realizing that things weren't going to be fixed from the outside. That no one else could smooth this over for her. That the absence she had engineered was now shaping the night in ways she couldn't control. Eventually, a message came through that was different from the rest. Short, unpolished. It didn't demand anything. It didn't ask for explanations. It simply said things were falling apart. I read it once and set the phone down. That was the moment I knew the collapse was real. Not because of the logistics, or the whispers, or the raised voices, but because certainty had finally cracked. The belief that everything would hold as long as no one questioned it had been replaced by something far more dangerous. Reality. I lay back on the bed and closed my eyes, the motel room pressing in softly around me. The air felt heavier, charged with the aftermath of decisions finally meeting consequence. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired, and beneath that, strangely at peace. This wasn't revenge in the way people imagine it. There was no confrontation, no public reckoning, no dramatic reveal. Just a system collapsing under the weight of its own assumptions. I had not pushed it. I had stepped away and let gravity do the rest. As the night deepened, I understood that whatever was happening now would continue long after the guests left and the lights were turned off. It would follow them into the weeks and months ahead, into conversations and realizations that couldn't be undone. And my daughter would have to face it without the safety net she had taken for granted. That knowledge didn't make me cruel. It made me honest. By the time the night finally went quiet, there was nothing left to manage. The collapse they couldn't control was complete, not in spectacle, but in certainty. And I knew without doubt that the call I had been expecting would come next. The noise didn't return the way I expected. After hours of frantic messages and half-heard arguments, the night settled into something quieter and more dangerous. Silence after chaos isn't peace. It's the moment people stop trying to control the story and start realizing they can't. I lay on the bed with the lamp off, the glow from my phone the only light in the room. It stayed dark longer than before. No buzzing, no demands. Just a waiting stillness that told me the problems had moved beyond surface fixes. When the phone finally lit up again, it wasn't with urgency. It was with questions. They weren't addressed to me directly. Not yet. They were questions being asked around me, about things no one had bothered to clarify because everything had always worked before. Financial assumptions, timelines, commitments that existed because everyone believed they did. Belief is a fragile thing when it isn't backed by understanding. I received a message meant for someone else, forwarded without explanation. It was short-clipped and unmistakably tense. It asked for documentation, for confirmation, for clarity that should have been settled long ago. The tone wasn't angry. It was unsettled. I felt a familiar ache then, not in my chest, but lower, deeper. The ache of knowing that when truth begins to surface, it rarely does so gently. Another message followed this one, clearly written in haste. It mentioned discrepancies, not accusations. Not yet, just gaps between what had been presented and what could be verified. Gaps have a way of widening when people start looking at them closely. I thought about the groom again, about the way he spoke in broad strokes, always pointing forward, rarely grounding anything in specifics. I had told myself that was confidence, vision, ambition. Now it looked different. Confidence doesn't unravel under scrutiny. Stories do. A voicemail came through from an unfamiliar number. I listened this time. The voice on the other end was low-controlled but strained. Someone was explaining something to someone else, choosing words carefully, backtracking mid-sentence, trying to align a narrative that no longer fit. It ended abruptly, the line going dead before anyone said goodbye. I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, letting the implications settle. This was no longer about a delayed ceremony or an embarrassed venue. This was about exposure. About people realizing they hadn't asked the right questions because they liked the answers they assumed they already had. Money has a way of clarifying things, not because it changes people, but because it removes the space where pretending can survive. I thought about my daughter then more directly than I had all night. I imagined her standing somewhere just out of view, caught between conversations she didn't know how to navigate. Hearing things she hadn't wanted to hear. Realizing that some of the certainty she had built her future on was thinner than she believed. There was a temptation to soften that image, to frame her as a victim of someone else's deception, to tell myself she had simply been misled. But that wouldn't be honest. She had chosen image over discomfort, silence over questions, distance over conversation. Being misled doesn't erase the choice to look away. That truth sat heavily with me, but I didn't push it aside. Love doesn't require rewriting reality to stay intact. Another message came in, this one longer, more measured. It acknowledged that things were not aligning, that explanations were being requested, that the night had taken a direction no one anticipated. I noticed how carefully it avoided assigning blame. Blame comes later, after certainty is gone. I rolled onto my side and listened to the motel settle further into sleep. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed briefly, then quieted. Life continued in small, contained ways, untouched by the unraveling happening miles away. I wondered if my daughter was still wearing her dress. If the fabric felt heavier now, less like celebration and more like expectation pressing in from all sides. I wondered if she was beginning to understand the cost of maintaining an image when the foundation beneath it starts to shift. Another message arrived. This one was different. It wasn't angry, it wasn't demanding, it wasn't even directed at fixing anything. It was confused. It asked how this could be happening. I read it twice and felt something loosen in my chest. Confusion is the first honest emotion in a collapse. It means certainty has finally broken. I didn't respond. Understanding can't be handed to someone in the middle of denial. It has to arrive on its own, carried by consequences they can't ignore. I thought back to moments years earlier, times when I almost spoke up. When I sensed imbalance but told myself it wasn't my place. When I chose peace over discomfort, believing that silence would preserve harmony. Truth delayed doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And when it finally surfaces, it does so with interest. The phone stayed quiet again for a long stretch. Long enough for me to close my eyes and breathe evenly, letting the night deepen around me. I wasn't exhausted in the way I expected. I felt alert, present, grounded in a way I hadn't been for years. This was what stepping back felt like. Not numbness, not detachment, just clarity without the constant pull to intervene. Eventually, another message came through. It didn't mention the ceremony. It didn't mention logistics. It simply said that certain people were asking questions that didn't have easy answers. That was the point of no return. Once questions move from whispers to conversations, the story changes. Once people realize they've been operating on assumptions, trust begins to erode in places no apology can reach. I imagined alliances shifting quietly, support recalculated. The groom's family reevaluating their position, not emotionally, but strategically. When status and stability are threatened, loyalty becomes conditional. I felt no satisfaction in that image, only a quiet sadness for the simplicity that could have existed if honesty had been chosen earlier. I turned onto my back and folded my hands over my chest, staring into the darkness. This was not the night I had imagined when I started driving before sunrise. It was heavier, more complicated, more revealing. But it was also truthful. Another message arrived just before midnight. Short, uncertain. It didn't ask for help. It didn't ask for explanations. It simply acknowledged that nothing was certain anymore. I set the phone aside and let the room go dark again. Once truth begins to leak, it doesn't stop because someone asks it to. It seeps into every conversation, every glance, every quiet moment where people reassess what they thought they knew. Whatever was happening now would continue long after the lights were turned off and the guests went home. It would follow them into the days ahead, into decisions that could no longer be postponed. I didn't need to witness it to understand it. As sleep finally came, it wasn't heavy or dreamless. It was light, broken by brief images and half-formed thoughts. But beneath it all was a steady awareness. The truth had started to surface. And once it does, it never retreats quietly. I was still awake when the call finally came. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the alarm clock on the nightstand, its numbers steady and indifferent. I had been lying there for a long time, not waiting exactly, but aware. Some moments announce themselves before they arrive. My phone rang once. I let it ring a second time before reaching for it, not out of calculation, but because my body needed that breath. Her name filled the screen. Seeing it sent a dull ache through me, familiar and sharp at the same time. I answered without saying anything. Her voice came through immediately, rushed and uneven. She didn't say hello. She didn't say Dad. She started talking as if the conversation had already been going on for minutes, as if we were picking up where we'd left off before everything went wrong. She talked about the night, about how nothing was working the way it was supposed to, about people asking questions she didn't have answers for. She said things were spiraling, that it didn't make sense, that no one understood how this could be happening. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I could hear the strain in her voice, the way she was trying to keep it together and failing in small, uneven ways. She spoke quickly, afraid of silence, afraid that if she paused, the weight of everything would drop on her all at once. She never mentioned the gate. Not at first. She spoke around it like you talk around a bruise you don't want pressed. She said there had been misunderstandings. That things had gotten complicated. That people were being unreasonable. She said it felt like everything she had worked for was slipping away all at once. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the pillow, letting her words wash over me without reacting. I had spent years filling in gaps for her, anticipating what she needed before she asked. Tonight I let the gaps remain. When she finally stopped talking, the silence between us was loud enough to feel physical. I took a breath and spoke quietly. Why wasn't I allowed through the gate? The line went still. For a moment I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard her swallow. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Lower, more careful. She said it wasn't like that. That it wasn't personal. That everything had been so sensitive and there were expectations and pressures. I wouldn't understand. She said she just needed things to go smoothly. Just for one day. Just for one day. I asked her if she had planned to tell me beforehand. Another pause, longer this time. She said she was going to explain later. After. When things calmed down. She said she didn't think I'd take it well. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because of how familiar it sounded. I had been managing my reactions my entire life, so others wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable. And still, I was cast as the risk. I told her I understood that she wanted things to look perfect. I told her I understood pressure. I told her I understood fear. What I didn't tell her was how much it hurt to be treated like a problem, to be hidden. She started to cry, then the sound breaking through whatever control she had left. Her words tumbled over each other. She said she needed help. She said she didn't know what to do. She said people were turning cold, that things she thought were secure suddenly weren't. She didn't ask directly. She didn't have to. The request was threaded through every word. Fix this. Make it stop. Do what you always do. I felt the old instinct rise up immediately. The urge to soothe, to promise to shoulder the weight so she wouldn't have to feel it. That instinct had shaped my entire life as a father. It didn't disappear just because I finally saw it clearly. But I didn't follow it. I told her I was sorry she was hurting. And I meant it. I told her that nights like this are overwhelming, that fear can make everything feel larger and more urgent than it is. Then I told her something else. I told her I wasn't going to fix it. The silence that followed was sharp and stunned. When she spoke again, her voice was thin, almost disbelieving. She asked what I meant. She asked if I understood what was happening. She asked how I could sit there and do nothing. I told her I was doing something. I was letting her face the consequences of a choice she made. She protested immediately. She said I was being unfair, that I was punishing her, that I was choosing this moment to make a point. I told her calmly that I wasn't punishing her. I was stepping back, that there was a difference. I explained that help given without respect isn't help, it's erasure. And that when she chose to remove me from her wedding to protect an image, she made it clear how she saw my place in her life. She tried to interrupt me, but I kept going, my voice steady, not raised. I told her that I loved her, that love hadn't disappeared because I set a boundary, that love doesn't require me to disappear so she can feel comfortable. She cried harder then. The sound was raw, unfiltered, stripped of explanation and defense. She said she didn't mean it that way. She said she never thought it would come to this. I believed her, in a way. People rarely think through the full weight of their choices when the system around them has always absorbed the impact. This was the first time it hadn't. I told her something else, then something I hadn't planned to say but knew was true. I told her that if I stepped in now, nothing would change. That she would learn that panic earns rescue, that exclusion has no cost as long as it's wrapped in enough pressure. I told her I couldn't teach her that anymore. The crying softened into something quieter, more exhausted. She asked me what she was supposed to do. I told her she was supposed to stand where she was and figure it out. That discomfort is sometimes the only teacher that works. We stayed on the line like that for a while, neither of us speaking. The silence was no longer frantic. It was heavy, reflective, filled with things neither of us could undo. When she finally spoke again, her voice was small. She asked if this meant I was done with her. That question hurt more than anything else she'd said. I told her no. I told her love doesn't disappear because you step back. It changes shape. It waits. It watches. It stops interfering. I told her I would always be her father. But I would no longer save her from choices she refused to examine. She didn't argue after that. She didn't apologize either. She just breathed on the other end of the line like someone trying to steady themselves after a fall. When I told her I was going to hang up, she didn't ask me to stay. She said good night. The words sounded strange between us, formal and fragile. I ended the call and set the phone down carefully, as if it were something breakable. Then I sat there, unmoving, let the weight of it settle fully into my body. That was the last moment I could have rescued her without rescuing the system that had erased me. I didn't feel relief. I felt grief, clean and sharp and honest. But beneath that grief was something else, a quiet certainty that this conversation, painful as it was, had been necessary. From this point forward, she would have to stand alone in the consequences of her choices, and I would have to learn how to love her without disappearing. Morning came quietly. The light slipped through the thin curtains without asking permission, pale and ordinary, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then the memory returned, not like a blow, but like a weight settling back into place. The wedding night was over. The call had been made. Nothing had been fixed. I sat up on the edge of the bed and waited for regret to arrive. It didn't. What I felt instead was a steady calm that surprised me. Not relief, not satisfaction, just a sense that something final had already happened, and there was no benefit in pretending otherwise. The world outside the motel room sounded the same as it always did. Cars starting, doors closing, someone laughing too loudly in the hallway. Life had not paused for my family drama, and somehow that helped. I washed my face in the small sink and studied my reflection in the mirror. I looked older than I remembered, the lines deeper around my eyes, the gray in my hair, less forgiving in the daylight. But there was something else there, too. A steadiness I hadn't seen in a long time. For decades, my first instinct every morning had been the same. What needs fixing today? Who needs me to smooth things over? Where can I absorb pressure so someone else doesn't have to feel it? That instinct didn't disappear overnight. I felt it stir as I packed my bag, folding clothes, carefully lining my shoes up the way I always did. Part of me still wanted to reach for the phone, to check messages, to see if there was some new crisis I could step into and resolve. I didn't. I knew what would happen if I did. I would find a way to help just enough to pull the situation back from the edge, and in doing so, I would erase the boundary I had finally drawn. I would teach her that all it took was enough fear to bring me running. That lesson had already cost us too much. I sat back down on the bed and let myself think about the temptation to turn back. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It came in small, reasonable thoughts. Maybe you could just clarify one thing. Maybe you could explain your side so she understands. Maybe you could help quietly without undoing everything. Those thoughts were dangerous because they sounded like compassion. But compassion without boundaries had been my mistake for years. I thought about what turning back would actually teach her. Not the words I might say, but the behavior I would model. That exclusion could be explained away. That removing someone doesn't matter if you feel bad afterward. That image is still worth protecting, even when it costs dignity. I couldn't teach her that, and still respect myself. I checked out of the motel without incident. The clerk barely looked up, slid my receipt across the counter, and wished me a good day. I thanked her and meant it. There was something grounding about being treated like just another man passing through. The drive home felt different from the drive away. Slower, more deliberate. I wasn't replaying conversations or imagining alternate endings. I wasn't rehearsing speeches I'd never give. The road simply unfolded in front of me mile after mile, and I followed it without urgency. As I drove, I thought about the life I had built around giving without asking. I had always been proud of that. Proud that I didn't need recognition. Proud that I could be relied on without reminders. Proud that my love came without conditions. But pride has blind spots. I had confused generosity with obligation. I had believed that being needed was the same as being valued. And in doing so, I had taught my daughter a version of love that required my constant self-erasure. That wasn't her fault alone. It was a pattern we built together. I didn't hate myself for it. I didn't blame her entirely either. I just saw it clearly for the first time. There is a difference between helping someone stand and holding them upright so long they forget how to balance. I had done the latter for years, thinking it was kindness. As the miles passed, I thought about the cost of dignity. People talk about dignity like it's an abstract idea, something you either have or don't. They don't talk about the price, the loneliness, the misunderstanding, the way others will frame your boundaries as cruelty, because it's easier than examining their own expectations. Choosing not to turn back meant accepting all of that. It meant accepting that my daughter might tell a version of this story where I was cold, where I abandoned her at her lowest point, where my refusal to step in was framed as punishment rather than self-preservation. I couldn't control that, and for once, I didn't try. By the time I reached my town, The afternoon light had shifted softer, now familiar. I drove past streets I'd known for decades, houses that held memories I rarely revisited. Everything looked the same, and yet I felt different moving through it. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, sitting there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. The house was quiet. No one waiting inside. No calls to return. No immediate needs. That silence would have terrified me once. Now it felt earned. Inside, I set my bag down and moved through the rooms, slowly noticing details I had overlooked for years. A picture frame slightly crooked. A plant that needed water. The hum of the refrigerator filling the space. This was my life. Not a backdrop to someone else's story, but a place that existed on its own terms. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring out the window without really seeing anything. Thoughts came and went, but none of them demanded action. That was new. I understood then that not turning back wasn't a single decision. It was a series of small refusals I would have to make again and again. Refusing to explain myself to people who didn't want to understand. Refusing to soften boundaries to make others comfortable. Refusing to confuse guilt with responsibility. That would be the real work. I didn't know what the future held for my relationship with my daughter. I knew it wouldn't go back to what it was. Some things can't be unseen. Some patterns once broken don't fit together the same way again. That didn't mean there was no future. It just meant it would be built differently if it was built at all. I thought about the word dignity again. Not as pride, not as stubbornness, but as alignment. The quiet sense that your actions match your values even when the cost is high. That alignment was what I felt now. I spent the rest of the day doing ordinary things. Sorting mail, cleaning out a drawer that had been jammed for months, cooking a simple dinner for one and eating it without distraction. Each small task grounded me further in the present, away from the chaos I had left behind. As evening came, I noticed something else. The anxiety that had lived in my chest for years, the constant readiness to respond, had loosened. Not disappeared entirely, but softened. Like a muscle finally allowed to rest. I didn't mistake that for happiness. It was something quieter and more durable. Peace earned through discomfort rather than avoidance. Before bed, I checked my phone once. There were no new messages, no updates, no emergencies. The world had not ended because I hadn't intervened. I set the phone down and turned off the light. Not turning back had been the hardest choice I'd ever made. Harder than working through grief. Harder than raising a child alone. Because it required me to let go of the role I had wrapped my identity around for so long. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the familiar sounds of my own home, I knew it had also been the most necessary. Somewhere, consequences were still unfolding. Conversations were still happening without me. Lessons were still being learned the long way around. For the first time, that wasn't my responsibility. And in accepting that, I felt something settle into place that had been missing for years. Weeks passed before the noise reached me again, and even then, it arrived softly, like weather you sense before you see. I didn't ask questions. I didn't check in. I went back to my routines and let the distance do what distance is meant to do. My mornings returned to their old shape. Coffee before sunrise, a quiet house, the sound of my own footsteps moving from room to room without anyone needing anything from me. At first, the stillness felt unfamiliar, like wearing a coat that didn't quite fit. Then gradually it became something else, a kind of relief I hadn't known I was allowed to feel. I heard about the aftermath the way you hear about storms that hit somewhere else. Secondhand, fragmented, a comment from a neighbor who knew someone, a careful mention from a relative who didn't know how much to say. No one wanted to be the messenger. No one wanted to choose a side. That told me enough. The marriage hadn't begun the way it was meant to. That much was clear. When a wedding starts with uncertainty, it doesn't magically transform into stability just because vows are exchanged. The cracks that appeared that night didn't seal themselves shut when the lights went out. I learned that some of the guests drifted away early, offering polite excuses that fooled no one. That conversations afterward felt strained, rehearsed. That the story everyone agreed to tell didn't quite line up, and the effort it took to maintain it exhausted people faster than expected. Image requires energy. Once people stop supplying it, things unravel quickly. What surprised me was how quickly support vanished once appearances cracked. Relationships that had seemed solid were suddenly unavailable. Calls went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. People who had been eager to attach themselves to promise and prestige quietly recalculated when those things became uncertain. I didn't take pleasure in hearing any of this. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation. Conditional loyalty always disappears the moment conditions change. My daughter's new reality reached me in pieces, never directly. I heard she was overwhelmed. That she was tired in a way sleep didn't fix. That she was facing questions she didn't know how to answer, not just about the marriage, but about herself. I wondered how often she thought about the gate, about the decision she had made in a moment of fear and calculation. I wondered if she framed it as a necessary compromise, or if in quieter moments she recognized it as something else entirely. I didn't call to ask. There is a difference between abandoning someone and allowing them to feel the full weight of their choices. I had spent too many years blurring that line. This time I held it steady. My own life, in contrast, began to settle in ways I hadn't anticipated. I slept better, deeper, without waking up at the slightest vibration of my phone. My body felt less braced, less prepared for impact that never came. I realized how much emotional labor I had been carrying without naming it. The constant readiness to intervene. The habit of scanning conversations for problems I could prevent. The way my thoughts had always circled around other people's comfort. Without that constant pull, my mind grew quieter. I started taking longer walks in the mornings, not to clear my head, but because I enjoyed them. I noticed things I'd passed by for years without seeing. A neighbor's dog that always barked once, then wagged its tail. The way the light fell differently depending on the season. Small, ordinary details that made life feel anchored again. Every so often, guilt would surface. It always does. It asked familiar questions. Are you being too harsh? What kind of father lets his child struggle? Shouldn't love mean stepping in no matter what? I didn't ignore those questions. I answered them honestly. Love doesn't mean removing every obstacle from someone's path. Sometimes it means letting them feel the ground under their feet, even when it's uneven. Especially when it's uneven. I knew that if I reached out too soon, I would soften the lesson. Not out of kindness, but out of habit. And habits are powerful things. They don't change just because you understand them. So I stayed where I was. Weeks turned into months. The intensity of that night faded, replaced by something quieter and more enduring. Not resolution, not reconciliation, just reality, settling into its new shape. Then one afternoon, I received a message that felt different from the others that had come before it. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't ask for help. It didn't accuse or explain. It simply said that my daughter had started asking different questions. Not who could fix things, not how to make everything look right again, but how things had gotten to that point in the first place. That was the first time I allowed myself a small cautious hope. Accountability doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in slowly, usually after denial has exhausted itself. It starts with curiosity instead of defense, with reflection instead of blame. I didn't respond to the message right away. I sat with it, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a request. It was an update. A sign that something inside her might be shifting. That mattered. I thought back to the years when I had mistaken silence for harmony. When I believed that avoiding discomfort preserved relationships, I knew now how wrong that was. Avoidance doesn't preserve anything. It delays collapse. If there was a future between my daughter and me, it would have to be built on something sturdier than habit and obligation. It would have to include honesty, boundaries, a mutual understanding that love doesn't require disappearance. Whether she was ready for that, I didn't know. What I did know was that I was no longer willing to trade my dignity for proximity. Not again. I continued living my life as I had rebuilt it, slowly, deliberately, with attention. I didn't shut myself off. I didn't harden. I simply stopped volunteering to be erased. Friends noticed the change before I did. They said I seemed lighter, more present, less distracted. I didn't explain why. Some things don't need to be explained to be true. On evenings when the house felt especially quiet, I let myself feel the loneliness without trying to fix it. Loneliness acknowledged is less dangerous than loneliness denied. It passes more easily when you don't pretend it isn't there. I thought about my daughter often, but not obsessively. Not with the old urgency. More like you think about someone walking a path you once walked yourself, knowing you can't walk it for them. That distance didn't mean I stopped caring. It meant I cared differently. When I imagined the future now, it wasn't centered on restoring what had been lost. It was centered on what could be built, if anything was to be built at all. Something slower, something more honest, something that didn't rely on my silence to function. That was the only kind of relationship I was willing to have anymore. The aftermath they had to face alone wasn't cruel. It was necessary. It stripped away the illusions that had made everything look stable while nothing underneath truly was. And in stepping back far enough to let that happen, I had given both of us something I never could have provided by stepping in. The chance to grow without erasure. Whether she would take it was up to her. For the first time, that truth didn't frighten me. The morning light felt different months later, softer somehow, like it had learned how to enter the room without asking too much of me. I woke up to the quiet hum of the house and lay there for a moment listening. No tension in my chest, no urge to reach for my phone, just stillness earned slowly one ordinary day at a time. My life had settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I was missing. Coffee at the kitchen table, the newspaper folded neatly beside me. The small rituals that had once felt like placeholders now felt complete on their own. Peace didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived like this quietly, and then stayed. I thought often about what that day had taken from me. The image I carried for years of walking my daughter down the aisle. The belief that every sacrifice eventually leads to gratitude. The comfort of thinking love alone could prevent distance. Losing those things hurt more than I expected, even after the anger and shock had faded. Grief doesn't disappear just because you choose dignity. It changes shape. It becomes something you carry without letting it carry you. What surprised me was what I gained in return, clarity for one. The kind that doesn't shout or demand attention, but steadies you when you're tempted to doubt yourself. I gained the ability to see myself as more than a supporting character in someone else's story. More than a resource. More than a background presence meant to smooth rough edges. For the first time in decades, I felt aligned with myself. My actions matched my values even when the cost was high. Especially then. I began to understand something I wish I'd learned earlier. Love that requires you to erase yourself isn't love. It's control even when it wears a gentle face, and love that respects boundaries doesn't disappear when you step back. It adjusts. It waits. It allows room for growth on both sides. I know there are other parents listening to this who recognize parts of themselves in my story. Mothers and fathers who have swallowed discomfort to keep the peace, who have stepped aside quietly so their children could shine, who have told themselves that being needed is the same as being valued. It isn't. Loving your child doesn't mean surrendering your dignity. It doesn't mean accepting erasure in the name of harmony. And it certainly doesn't mean rescuing them from every consequence so they never learn to stand on their own. Setting boundaries doesn't make you cold. It makes you honest. As for my daughter and me, we're not back where we once were. I don't know if we ever will be. We speak now, carefully, more slowly. There's less assumption in our conversations, more listening. No grand reconciliation, no dramatic apologies. Just the quiet work of learning how to speak without taking each other for granted. Respect, once broken, has to be rebuilt deliberately, brick by brick. And it takes time. I don't regret stepping back. I regret that it took so long to understand why I needed to. If I could speak to the version of myself who sat in that car outside the wedding gate, I wouldn't tell him to be stronger or braver. I'd tell him he was already strong enough. He just needed permission to stop disappearing. That's why I told this story. Not for revenge, not for validation, but because too many people believe they have to choose between love and self-respect. You don't. The truth is, love that survives without self-respect was never really love to begin with. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, I want you to know you're not alone. And if you've ever found yourself standing quietly at the edge of someone else's life, wondering when you stopped mattering, I hope this gives you permission to step back and ask why. If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts or your own experiences in the comments. Sometimes the most healing conversations happen between people who've lived through similar silence. And if stories like this resonate with you, I invite you to stay here. Subscribe, stay connected, and spend some time with others who believe that dignity, boundaries, and quiet strength still matter. Because love doesn't disappear when you step back. Sometimes that's when it finally has room to breathe.